The year is 1883. The place, Fort Defiance, Arizona Territory. A name that sounded more like a challenge than a promise. The air in the medical tent was thick with the ghosts of yesterday's battles and tomorrow's fevers. It smelled of carbolic acid, whiskey, and the cheap canvas sweating under a moonless sky. Outside, the sounds of the fort were a low, constant murmur, the nicker of horses, the distant strum of a poorly tuned guitar, the lonely call of a bugle cutting through the dark. Inside, there was only the hiss of a single lantern and the quiet, methodical movements of one man. Dr. Alistair Kane, a man of 50 years who looked 70, moved between the rows of cots with the practiced economy of someone who had seen too much to waste a single motion. His face was a road map of past griefs, carved by a Confederate war and the 2 decades of silence that followed. His hands, though, were steady. They had to be. They were the only part of him that still remembered their purpose without question. He adjusted the damp cloth on the forehead of a young trooper shaking with malaria, his movements precise, detached. He worked alone tonight. The orderlies were young, clumsy, and too full of questions he had no energy to answer. Solitude was a familiar balm, a quiet space where he could let the silence do the talking. Some men don't die from bullets. They die from silence. From holding in things they should have shouted. From the hollow space a memory carves inside you until there's nothing left but the echo. He paused, his gaze drifting to a framed, faded photograph on his small writing desk. A young girl with bright, laughing eyes. His Lily. 20 years. 20 years of silence. He closed his eyes, the familiar ache tightening in his chest. You ever sit alone at night wondering if you missed your one chance to make something right? The question wasn't the thought, it was the rhythm of his own heart. For Alistair Kane, the answer was yes. Every single night. The tent flap was thrown open abruptly, letting in a gust of wind and 2 burly troopers carrying a makeshift stretcher. They were rough, their faces grim in the flickering lamplight. "Doctor, we found another one out near the wash, barely breathing," one of them grunted, a sweat beading on his brow. Alistair turned, his professional mask sliding back into place. On the stretcher lay a figure so small and still he first thought it was a child. It was a woman, Apache, no older than Lily would have been. Her skin was pale beneath the dust and grime, her black hair matted and tangled. A fever burned in her, a dry heat he could feel from 3 feet away. He gestured to an empty cot. "Put her there, gently." They moved with a grudging care, lowering her onto the thin mattress. Her clothes were little more than rags, torn and stained from a hard journey. He saw bruises on her arms, the kind left by a rough hand. As they stepped back, the woman's eyes fluttered open. They weren't wild or afraid. They were ancient, exhausted, filled with a stillness that unsettled him. Her gaze found his, and her lips, cracked and dry, parted. "C'est elle, c'est Jean." She repeated the sentiment, so there would be no mistake. "Just kill me." The troopers exchanged a nervous glance. Alistair's expression didn't change, but something inside him, a cold, weary thing, nodded in recognition. He understood that request. He understood the desire for a final, quiet end to suffering. In her plea, he heard an echo of his own exhausted soul. He saw not a patient to be saved, but a path to a shared final peace. He waved a dismissive hand at the soldiers. "Get out. I'll handle this." They didn't need to be told twice. The tent flap fell shut, plunging the tent back into an intimate silence, now shared by 2 broken people.
Alistair stood over her for a long moment, the lantern casting his shadow like a giant, hunched specter on the canvas wall. He picked up a wet cloth and began to gently clean the dirt from her face. Her skin was hot to the touch, the fever raging. There was a deep cut on her temple, crusted with dried blood. She didn't flinch. She simply lay there, her breathing shallow, her eyes closed now, as if awaiting the inevitable. This was routine. Assess the injuries, fight the fever, set the bones. He was a doctor. It was what he did. But tonight, her words lingered in the air, a permission slip he hadn't known he was waiting for. To let go, to not fight, to simply allow the suffering to end. He reached for his stethoscope, the cold metal a familiar weight in his palm. He needed to listen to her lungs, to know how much time she had. To do that, he would need to move the torn fabric of her blouse. His fingers went to the top button, his touch clinical, impersonal. This was a body, an engine of suffering, nothing more. As he worked the button free, his fingers brushed against something hard and cool beneath the cloth. An amulet, perhaps, a piece of tribal medicine. Many of the Apache wore them. He paid it no mind, focusing on the task. He unbuttoned another. The fabric fell away slightly, and in the dim light, he saw it. Not a stole, not a carving, a glint of gold. Tarnished, but undeniably gold. He frowned. It was a locket, of a type a white woman would wear. A strange thing for an Apache girl to have. A memory stirred, a wisp of a thing, easily dismissed. He had a job to do. He placed the stethoscope against her chest, but his mind was not on the sound of her breathing. It was on the object his fingers had found. The shape of it, the feel of it. A small oval locket. His heart gave a sudden painful lurch. It couldn't be. His movements were no longer clinical. They were urgent, trembling. He set the stethoscope aside, his breath catching in his throat. With hands that shook for the first time in 20 years, he reached for the locket, carefully parting the torn fabric of her blouse just enough to see it clearly. The lantern light caught the dull metal. It was oval, with a delicate floral engraving around the edge, now worn smooth with time. There was a small, familiar dent on the lower right side from where a little girl had dropped it on the stone hearth one winter morning. Time stopped. The air in the tent became thick, unbreathable. The sounds of the fort faded into a roaring silence in his ears. It was his wife's locket, the one he had given his daughter Lily on her 5th birthday. The locket he had buried an empty coffin for 20 years ago.
The world narrowed to the small, golden oval in his trembling hand. It was an anchor in a sea of impossible, roaring silence, the one solid thing in a universe that had just shattered around him. Alistair's breath was a ragged tear in the quiet of the tent. His fingers, trained to navigate the delicate architecture of bone and sinew, fumbled with the tiny clasp. It was stiff, sealed by 2 decades of dust and disuse. For a frantic moment, he thought he would break it. Then, with a faint click, it sprang open. Inside, behind a cracked, yellowed piece of isinglass, was the miniature portrait he had painted himself. His wife, Sarah, her smile as gentle and sad as he remembered. And opposite her, the lock of baby-fine blonde hair, tied with a blue ribbon. Lily's hair. He stumbled back, a low, guttural sound escaping his throat, a sound of a man being unmade from the inside out. He collided with his small writing desk, sending vials and instruments clattering to the dirt floor. The framed photograph of Lily toppled over, her bright, laughing eyes hidden from view. He stared at the woman on the cot, this stranger, This Apache, this ghost wearing the skin of his daughter's life. Who are you? His voice was a raw whisper, barely audible. The woman's eyes remained closed. Her breathing was shallow, a faint flag of life in a body surrendering to the fever. The question hung in the air, unanswered, monstrous. For 20 years, Alistair had lived with a neat, tidy grave in his heart. Lily, taken by a Comanche raid. That was the story. A clean wound he could nurse with whiskey and silence. It was a tragedy with a clear ending. This was chaos. This was a story with no beginning and an impossible middle. This was a ghost rising not from the grave, but from a past he never knew existed. His medical training kicked in, a lifeboat in the storm. The fever. He had to fight the fever. Hope, that treacherous, long-dormant thing, was a fragile flicker. He couldn't let this fever be the final answer. Not now. He worked with a new desperate urgency. He forced a tincture of quinine and willow bark between her lips. He bathed her face and neck with cool water, fighting the dry heat that consumed her. He worked not as a doctor treating a patient, but as a man fighting a fire that threatened to consume the last impossible remnant of his world. Hours bled into a gray, pre-dawn light. The fever raged, a relentless tide. There were moments she'd cry out delirious words in her own tongue, her body arching in pain. In those moments, Alistair would hold her hand, whispering, "It's all right. I'm here. Just hold on." He didn't know if he was talking to her or to the ghost of his daughter she represented. As the sun began to cast long, dusty rays through the tense opening, the fever finally broke. Her skin, once fiery, was now cool and damp with sweat. Her breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Alistair sank onto a nearby stool, utterly spent. The adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a vast, hollow exhaustion. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. She had the high cheekbones and strong jaw of her Apache heritage, her skin a sun-darkened copper. But her nose, it was Sarah's, the curve of her eyebrows, his own. He saw the scars on her arms, the hardship etched into the lines of her young face. What life had she lived? A life of struggle, of otherness, raised by the people he had been taught to see as enemies. What had she endured? He thought of Lily, his bright, happy Lily. And the thought that this woman's life of pain might have been hers was a fresh, twisting agony. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that this was his daughter, not the one he remembered, but the one who had survived. The question was, who had she survived? The Apache people were a mystery to him, a collection of fears and battlefield rumors. To find the truth, he would have to step out of the sterile safety of his tent and into a world he didn't understand. His first step was the Fort Scout, a grizzled old tracker named Jedediah. Jed knew the tribes better than any white men at the fort. He found him by the stables, mending a bridle. "Jed, I need a word," Alistair said, his voice flat to hide the tremor of emotion. Jed looked up, his pale eyes squinting in the morning light. He'd known Alistair for years, had seen the way grief had hollowed him out. Alistair described the woman, the locket. He kept his voice clinical, as if describing a peculiar case study. But Jed saw through it. He saw the frantic hope flickering behind the doctor's tired eyes. Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Yeah, Apache woman with a white man's locket. That's strange business," he thought for a moment, stroking his beard. "There's a band of Chiricahua that trades sometimes, led by a chief named Cochise son, a man called Nate. They're known to adopt orphans from raids. Been doing it for generations." Adopt. The word was a foreign concept in Alistair's world of clean lines between us and them.
They raise them as their own, Yad said, shrugging. If a child is lost or orphaned, they see it as the spirit's will for them to find a new family. As for the locket, maybe it was all she had of her past, a link. The pieces began to fall into a terrible, beautiful mosaic. Arrayed, my daughter, not killed, but taken, raised by the very people he had learned to fear. To understand her, he realized he had to understand them. He spent the next few days in a haze, tending to his patients by rote, while his mind raced. He read every book the fort's meager library had on Apache customs. He sat with Jed for hours, absorbing stories of their traditions, their beliefs, their wars. He learned of the white-painted woman ceremony for young girls, the complex kinship systems, the deep spiritual connection to the land. Meanwhile, in his tent, she began to heal. He fed her broth, cleaned her wounds. She remained silent, her dark eyes following his every move. There was no gratitude in her gaze, but a deep, weary watchfulness. She was a wild thing, cornered and assessing a threat. One afternoon, he sat by her cot, the locket in his hand. "This was my wife's," he said softly, his voice thick. "I gave it to my daughter. Her name was Lily." She stared at the locket, then back at him. Her expression was unreadable. Did she remember? Was there any glimmer of a life before this one? She slowly reached out a hand, not for the locket, but for his. Her fingers were calloused, her touch surprisingly gentle. She turned his palm over and traced the lines there with the fingertip. Then she looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than suspicion in her eyes. It was a flicker of something. Connection? Pity? A shadow fell across the tent entrance. Colonel Thompson stood there, a thick, imposing man with a handlebar mustache and a deep-seated hatred for all native peoples. "Kane, a word," he barked. He stepped inside, his eyes landing on the woman on the cot. His face curled in disgust. "You're wasting good medicine on that savage." "She's my patient, Colonel," Alistair said coldly. "She's the enemy," Thompson snarled. "I've just had word from a patrol. A band of Chiricahua warriors not 5 miles from here. They're looking for someone, a woman. Matches her description." His hand went to the pistol at his hip. "Looks like we have some leverage. A bargaining chip." The blood drained from Alistair's face. He looked from the colonel's cruel, determined face to the woman on the cot. His daughter, his bargaining chip, a piece on a board in a game he was just beginning to understand. The life he had just found, fragile as a bird's egg, was about to be crushed under the heel of the very world he belonged to.
For 20 years, Alistair Kane had been a ghost, a hollow man moving through the motions of living. In that single, terrible moment, the ghost died, and a father was reborn in a blaze of cold, protective fury. He rose to his feet slowly, placing himself between Colonel Thompson and the cot. His physical stature was no match for the colonel's, but the force of his will was a sudden, unbreachable wall. "She is not a bargaining chip, Colonel," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She is a patient under my care, and you will not touch her." Thompson's face flushed with anger. "Have you lost your mind, Kane? That is an Apache, a hostile. We are at war." "That is a woman," Alistair countered, his eyes locked on the colonel's. "And I am a doctor. My duty is to heal, not to hand people over to be used as tools in your games." The air in the tent crackled with tension. From the cot, the woman watched them, her dark eyes wide with a new kind of understanding. She may not have understood all the words, but she understood the meaning. She saw this white man, this doctor, standing between her and a man who radiated hate. "I am ordering you to stand aside," Thompson bellowed, his hand now gripping the handle of his revolver. "No." It was a single word, spoken without heat, but it carried the weight of 20 years of grief and a lifetime of regret. It was the word he should have shouted all those years ago, the word he had swallowed until it had nearly killed him. Thompson stared, dumbfounded by this act of open defiance from the quiet, broken doctor. He saw the iron in Alistair's spine, the unyielding fire in his eyes, and for a moment he faltered. He was a bully, accustomed to obedience born of fear. He didn't know how to fight a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. He snarled, a cornered animal. "You will regret this, Kane. I will have you court-martialed for treason." He spun on his heel and stormed out of the tent, his threats hanging in the silence. Alistair didn't watch him go. His attention was on his daughter. Her eyes were fixed on him, a question in their depths. He walked back to her cot and sat down on the stool, the anger draining away, leaving a strange, fierce clarity in its wake. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't protect her here. This fort, his home for 2 decades, had just become the most dangerous place on earth for her. He worked quickly, gathering supplies, a canteen of water, a pouch of dried meat, a packet of medicinal herbs, a spare buckskin dress in a trunk of abandoned patient belongings. It would be better than the rags she wore. He found a worn buckskin dress in a trunk of abandoned patient belongings. It would be better than the rags she wore. He placed everything in a leather satchel. He turned back to her. "We have to go," he said simply. He held out the dress. "Can you—" She nodded, a slow, hesitant movement. With great effort, she sat up. Alistair averted his eyes, giving her privacy as she changed. When he looked back, she was standing, unsteady on her feet, but dressed. The buckskin suited her, made her look less like a victim and more like the survivor she was. "Lily?" He tried the name, a prayer on his tongue. She looked at him, and for the first time she spoke a full sentence in English, her voice raspy but clear. "They call me Tashunk. It means horse." She pointed a slender finger at the locket still around her neck. "Lily is a memory, a dream." The words were a gentle knife, cutting away the past he clung to. This was not the little girl from his photograph. This was Tashunk, a woman forged in a world he couldn't imagine. He had to accept that. He had to save the woman in front of him, not the ghost in his mind.
Tashunke, he repeated, testing the name. He nodded. "We must go now, before the colonel returns." The escape was a blur of adrenaline and shadow. Alistair knew the fort's routines, the blind spots in the sentry patrols. He led Tashunke out the back of the medical tent, through the darkness between the barracks, towards the low stone wall at the fort's northern edge. They moved in silence, a father and daughter united by a desperate flight, their shared history an unspoken bond between them. He helped her over the wall. The land beyond was dark and unwelcoming, a wilderness that had always represented danger to him. Now it represented their only hope. They walked for hours under a blanket of stars, guided by the cold, distant light. He had no plan, no destination. He was just putting one foot in front of the other, moving away from the past and towards an unknown future. As the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, they heard it. The sound of hoofbeats. Not the heavy shod horses of the cavalry, but the light, swift rhythm of unshod Apache ponies. They appeared over a rise, a group of 5 warriors, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun. They were armed, their faces painted for war. They saw Alistair and Tashunke and pulled their horses to a halt, forming a silent, intimidating line. Alistair instinctively moved in front of Tashunke, shielding her, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the confrontation he had both feared and on some level sought. He was finally meeting the people who had shaped his daughter's life. One of the warriors, a man with a noble bearing and streaks of yellow paint on his cheeks, dismounted and walked towards them. This must be Nate, the leader. Tashunke stepped out from behind Alistair. She called out a name, her voice clear and strong. The warrior's stern face broke into a look of profound relief. He spoke to her rapidly in their language, his words a mixture of concern and gentle scolding. She answered, her gestures pointing back towards the fort, then to Alistair. The warrior, Nate, turned his piercing gaze on Alistair. He looked at the white doctor, at his exhausted, determined face, at the way he stood protectively near the woman Nate considered a sister. He saw not an enemy, but an ally. He spoke, his English as clear and formal as Tashunke's was broken. "You are the doctor. You saved her." It wasn't a question. "She is my daughter," Alistair said, the words feeling both impossible and completely true. He held up the locket. Nate's eyes fell to the locket, and he nodded slowly in understanding. He had seen that locket many times, had seen Tashunke clutch it in moments of quiet reflection. "Our war is with the soldiers, with the bluecoats who break their promises and steal our land," Nate said, his voice resonating with authority. "It is not with a father who has found his child." He turned to Tashunke and they spoke again, a longer, more complex conversation. Alistair watched them, a strange peace settling over him. He was an outsider here, but for the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel alone. He was a part of her story, and she was a part of his. Tashunke finally turned back to him. There were tears in her eyes, but her voice was steady. "He says, you are welcome in our lands. He says a father's heart has a home in any nation." Alistair looked from his daughter, strong, resilient, a bridge between 2 worlds, to the Apache warrior who had shown him a grace he hadn't expected. He saw the future not as a lonely, straight road, but a winding path, a journey he would now take with her. He no longer had to die from the silence. He could finally begin to live with the sound of his daughter's voice, a melody in a language he was now ready to learn. The chapter of Lily was over. The story of Tashunke was just beginning.